Hello, Regulatory Affairs student. Welcome back to the Spring-Summer 2020 program, which will be online. We'll discuss the way the course is going to go for Post-Market Surveillance, RGL3300, on our Zoom call at 4 o'clock this afternoon. For now, I want to focus on Lesson 1, which will give you my understanding of the way we're going to be treating post-market surveillance in this course as we go forward. Now, one of the things that I want you to be aware of is that for me, post-market surveillance is not the way it's described by most pharmacovigilance programs, where a product is approved, it hits the market, and then post-market surveillance begins. Rather, I look at post-market surveillance as very much part of the regulatory life cycle. A lot of decisions on post-market surveillance are actually made at the pre-market approval stage for a lot of products. And so I look at post-market surveillance as being a factor throughout the regulatory life cycle. And we'll discuss that as we go through this lesson, okay? Now, a couple of some key concepts and ideas that I want to reiterate before we get too far into it is that the objective of sound management of chemicals is to apply managerial best practices to chemicals throughout their life cycle to prevent, and where this is not possible, to reduce or minimize the potential for harmful exposure of people and the environment to hazardous chemicals. That means that post-market surveillance for me begins very early on. When you're about to approve a product, a hazardous chemical product for market, you're already thinking about what the post-market surveillance implications will be, what the post-market surveillance obligations will be, and how will you know whether a chemical is being properly managed on the market. And this all requires strengthened governance, improved techniques and technologies in the production, use, storage, and disposal or recovery of chemicals throughout their life cycle. And how are we going to surveil that throughout the life cycle of a hazardous chemical product? All right. Now let's talk about some key concepts in terms of the stages where post-market surveillance is relevant. As I said, post-market surveillance is not just after the product hits the market. It begins, your thinking on post-market surveillance begins much earlier than that when you're approving a product. It begins at pre-market control and approvals to ensure that the chemical-based product to be placed on the market complies with regulatory requirements. At that stage, a regulator might set more stringent post-market surveillance requirements for particularly hazardous products going forward. So we have to understand how the pre-market approval stage impacts post-market surveillance. Obviously, in post-market surveillance, another important consideration is labeling and advertising control in post-market surveillance, because we want to make sure that we understand that the consumer is getting the proper information about a hazardous chemical product as it enters the market and while it's on the market, okay? And in some cases, we're dealing with an international standardization for this type of information and labeling, such as the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling, the GHS. But we'll be discussing that in greater detail as we go on in the course, all right? There's also post-market surveillance with respect to placing on-market controls. Most hazardous chemical manufacturers, for example, in pharmaceuticals and agrochemicals and others, are also under strict regulatory control. If you're producing pharmaceuticals, that facility must be registered, for example. All of these factors come into post-market surveillance. How is a product being produced? Even before it's sold onto the market, it has to meet certain stringent requirements with respect to best manufacturing practices, registered facilities, and so on and so forth. All of that gets captured by post-market surveillance as well. All right. So again, it's a much broader concept than you will see in discussions on pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and pharmacovigilance generally. Because placing on market controls are a key aspect of post-market surveillance. Okay. Then there's the post-market surveillance vigilance stage proper, the one that occurs once a product is on the market and you're monitoring whether it has any atypical negative effects on on humans or the environment when it's on the market, okay? And this means are we seeing the impacts of the product on the market that we anticipated at pre-market approval stage? Are we seeing something anomalous? Are we seeing something that's out of whack? Is it going to require us to make take any steps to address that issue, to manage the risk outlier that we're discovering? And so these are the types of things that occur when the product is on the market, and let's say we're encountering the die-off of bees, or particularly negative side effects of a pharmaceutical, or we're finding an industrial chemical that shouldn't be there but it's in the water system. Any number of issues like that obviously relate to post-market surveillance. But as I'm trying to impress upon you, post-market surveillance really is a consideration that is there from the very beginning in the approval of a product. Okay. Then we have a stage which is product advisories and recalls. If we discover something negative that we didn't anticipate as part of post-market surveillance, we obviously have to have some controls over how we manage that. And so we have that whole section of issues of product advisories and recalls. And if you go to Health Canada's product advisories and recalls database, you'll see that there are a lot of product advisories and recalls out there. The public is not always 100% aware or conscious of it, but there are many, and that's all part of the post-market surveillance issue. All right. A recall is when a product is removed from the market. An advisory might be a requirement for a new labeling, or just a public awareness campaign, or some other factors. But as we go through the course, we'll be dealing with some of these details more systematically as we go along. Okay. Now, in terms of the post-market surveillance, the other factor that I want you to take into consideration is that post-market surveillance also looks at the entire life cycle of a product to manage its risks. Okay, so students need to be aware of what I mean by the product life cycle. The life cycle concept is a very important one when we're dealing with chemicals management, because as we said, the objective of sound management of chemicals is to apply managerial best practices to chemicals throughout their life cycle, okay, to prevent, and where this is not possible, to reduce or minimize the potential harmful exposure of people in the environment to hazardous chemicals. That requires that we understand when we're regulating a pharmaceutical or an agrochemical or industrial chemical, we understand the areas where unnecessary risk can be posed by the product throughout its life cycle. So regulators who deal with hazardous products must be very sensitive to the regulatory life cycle as well as the product life cycle. Okay, and for example, if we're dealing with a very, very highly toxic chemical compound, regulators need to be aware of where risks and exposure to people in the environment can occur throughout the life cycle of that product to be able to do proper post-market surveillance. Okay, so we'll learn about that as we go through as well. All right. Now we know in this slide we learned that life cycle assessment originated with a methodology initially introduced in the 1970s. But it has evolved quite a bit, from cradle to grave to now to cradle, where we're seeing more and more emphasis on recycling of these chemical compounds. In lesson 3 of the course, we'll be going more into the life cycle related issues. We'll also talk a little bit about green chemistry as well. And green chemistry is an important factor because more and more governments are pressuring industry to come up with chemical compounds that are less toxic, certainly less persistent and less bioaccumulative, that will break down more harmlessly in the environment, okay, and pose less risks. And that's all part of the life cycle management aspect as well, okay, but we'll get into that in greater detail. This figure gives you a basic feel for the life cycle of a product. Now, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that regulations of chemical compounds occur at all stages of the life cycle. Okay, at the design stage, for example, the governments will regulate that you can't use certain types of chemicals to produce other chemicals. At the design stage, those regulations impact the design of chemical products. There's certain resource components in the acquisition of certain resources or certain products that can't be used or that are regulated to a certain specification. There are transportation regulations whenever you're dealing with hazardous compounds. You can't just back up a half-ton truck and throw a bunch of hazardous chemicals in the back. You have to have proper transportation equipment and so on. Obviously, manufacturers regulated. If you're producing hazardous chemicals, you have to control the runoff. You have to control water emissions, air emissions, land waste, and so on. And so on and so forth along the life cycle of a product. And so one of the things that I often tell students when they take a new job as regulators is the first thing you want to do with your employer is understand the life cycle of the product that that employer is producing. Because there will be, in the case of hazardous chemicals, regulations to one degree or another, and one type or another at virtually every stage of the product life cycle. And to understand very carefully how your product is being regulated, or your company's product is being regulated, you have to understand where risks exist at various stages of the product life cycle and how those need to be safely managed and accounted for. Okay? Now, the rest of the slides speak to various issues, okay? For example, design. Manufacturers must anticipate regulations related to avoiding banned substances as inputs, avoiding product design that could result in regulatory denial at the product approval stage. You recall that developing these chemicals is not a cheap proposition. It can take years to get approval for some of these compounds. And not making mistakes that will trip you up at the product design stage, at the product approval stage, is a very important consideration. And more, as I said, more and more governments are seeking green chemistry solutions. Resources and component acquisition, avoiding supply chains that operate outside accepted regulations and international standards for the environment, worker protection, for example. Making sure that resources and components are consistent with domestic regulations related to purity, safety, etc. These will all be factors at various stages. Transportation. Well, shipping companies must comply with numerous regulations when you're dealing with hazardous chemicals. Okay, employees in shipping and receiving, drivers, even loaders within a hazardous materials shipping business must have training consistent with federal and local regulations. Emergency response plans must be in place, so on. These are just examples, right? There are many other types of regulations, technical and otherwise, that will come into play. For example, technical regulations in transportation is a truck must have certain features. It must have certain safety considerations. It must be able to be locked. It must be, and so on and so forth. There are a number of very technical regulations related to transporting hazardous chemicals. Manufacturing, well, that's a no-brainer from an environmental regulatory point of view, right? Workplace health and safety standards, employment standards are important. Environmental regulations, water, air, soil emissions, hazardous waste management, energy use, building codes, regulations, and so on. There's all kinds of different manufacturing-related regulations. In fact, a lot of what we see in environmental regulation is dealing with industrial byproducts from producing chemicals, okay? Transportation and distribution of the finished product, okay, and how they must move about. For example, you can't ship hazardous chemicals in Canada without a safety data sheet attached, okay. They must have proper packaging and labeling requirements, workers using proper safety processes, practices, and equipment, and so on. All apply to that aspect of the hazardous chemical, its transportation and its distribution. All of those become factors of post-market surveillance. Okay, why? Because they impact the risk that was assumed when the product was approved for the market. If they fall outside the outliers of safety, then that risk profile of that approved product changes, doesn't it? And that's what post-market surveillance should be trying to capture. Customer use, very important thing, okay? That's why we have controls, for example, of pharmaceuticals not being used off-label, of making sure that labeling is adequate to inform the public about safety considerations and so on, okay? There's advertising controls and so on and so forth. All of these things we will address as we go forward. Obviously, recovery, waste separation, transportation, very important consideration. You can't have hazardous chemicals on the market and just dispose them and down the toilet or down the sink. There are certain rules with respect to the way hazardous products must be disposed of or must be recycled. There are numerous regulations in this area that can become a factor in post-market surveillance, okay? Well, they will be a factor in post-market surveillance. And recycling and final disposal, you can't just dispose of hazardous waste anywhere. They must go to a licensed facility, either a licensed incineration facility or an engineered landfill facility, so on. There are tons of regulations related to that. Environment Canada spends a lot of time tracking post-market surveilling where these hazardous compounds as wastes are going and making sure that they're in compliance with regulations. So as you can see, post-market surveillance, what we're going to learn on this, in my version of this course, is that post-market surveillance, when you're dealing with the three classes of chemicals, pharma, agro, and industrial, deals with a whole pile of aspects of monitoring these hazardous chemicals once they're on the market, okay? And setting up proper post-market surveillance from the earliest days of pre-market approval, and monitoring that as we go through. So I view very much post-market surveillance as a life cycle concept. It's something that you set up early and you monitor. And it's more than just whether somebody's taking a pharmaceutical and they're having nasty side effects, okay, and that gets reported. That's post-market surveillance and pharmacovigilance. But when you're dealing with post-market surveillance and agrochemicals and industrial chemicals, the equation becomes much more complex. You're dealing with regulations and ensuring their compliance at all stages of the product life cycle. So post-market surveillance becomes a much more complex phenomenon when you think about it in the reality of dealing with all aspects of the three classes of chemicals. So one thing I want to guard you against right now is that when I talk about post-market surveillance, I'm not talking about it the way that the pharmacovigilance programs or the pharmacists or the pharmacy industry speaks about post-market surveillance. That is part of what I talk about in post-market surveillance. But for me, post-market surveillance is monitoring the life of a product from its pre-market approval all the way to its final disposal. And when you're dealing with agrochemicals and industrial chemicals, that means life cycle management, okay? And pharmaceuticals as well. But when you're dealing with agrochemicals and industrial chemicals, even more so, the life cycle management aspects need to be considered very carefully, all right? So that was the main message that I wanted to get across with this lesson. Read the slides, think about it. We have our Zoom call at 4 o'clock today where we'll talk about how the course is going to unfold, and we can pick up any questions at that point. All right? So you have a good day, and we'll talk to you a little bit later. Bye-bye now.